I am deeply honored to have been invited to present the third annual Father John Meyendorff Lecture. For Father John Meyendorff, the Orthodox faith was the essence of the Byzantine legacy to the Orthodox Slavs. And in keeping with this primary understanding, in several of his works, he wrote of the Byzantine heritage and Rus in terms of three moments in time: the conversion of the Slavs, the conversion of Saint Vladimir and Rus, and the controversies and challenges of the 14th and 15th centuries. I have also chosen three moments in time to illustrate the Slavs and their relation to the Byzantine legacy. But I wish to illustrate or consider the changing nature and attitude of the Slavs, including those of Rus and Muscovite Russia, towards the whole of the Byzantine legacy. For the first moment in time, I will also begin with Saint Cyril and Methodius and the Glagolitic alphabet, a most remarkable achievement that forever linked Byzantium, Christianity, and the Slavs, in particular the Orthodox Slavs. I will begin with the very beginning, the significance of the Glagolitic letter A. Most of our information regarding the creation of the Glagolitic alphabet comes from the lives of Saint Cyril and Methodius. What generations of Orthodox took as a matter of faith in terms of the origins of this alphabet, subsequent generations of scholars attempted to explain through various theories. I have read many of these theories, but I'm convinced that no new theories are necessary. Indeed, careful scholarly analysis confirms the historical information about the origins of the Slavic alphabet that is largely found in the lives of Saint Cyril and Methodius. We now understand a great deal more about the Glagolitic alphabet and the specific historical circumstances that led to its creation. And now, having accepted that the alphabet was the work of one man, the most important realization is that the Glagolitic letter A and the other letters of the alphabet are therefore the result of the conscious decisions of this man, Constantine the philosopher, that is Saint Cyril, enlightener and apostle to the Slavs. And with this realization, we have the opportunity, or rather we have the obligation, to analyze and understand this very first letter of the alphabet in the context of our understanding of the person and mind that chose this letter to be the first letter of this new alphabet, an alphabet that was to help bring about the conversion of the Slavs and bring them to Christianity. It is in this context that two things, neither one of which is a coincidence, become clear. The first, as some scholars have remarked, is that the Hebrew character Aleph might have been the model for the Glagolitic A, the first letter of the alphabet. And second, that it is rather obvious that the Glagolitic A appears to be in the shape of a Christian symbol, the cross. The relationship and significance of these two concepts, the Hebrew Aleph and the cross, are unified in the Glagolitic A as the conscious, symbiotic result of the brilliant mind of Saint Cyril. We know that he was highly educated and a brilliant linguist and teacher. We know that he knew several languages and was certainly acquainted with all the alphabets of the Byzantine Empire. In other words, we know that Saint Cyril could have chosen any letter, or any portion of letter, or any combination of portions of letters to represent the first letter of the new Slavic alphabet. His specific choice, therefore, was deliberate, reasoned, and especially important. He chose a letter that reflects the Hebrew character Aleph, not just because it is the first letter of a new alphabet, but precisely because one of the earlier meanings of the Hebrew word Aleph was knowledge. That is, the beginning of the alphabet is the beginning of understanding, which is knowledge. But it is also obvious that this Glagolitic letter is clearly cross-shaped. Consider now the history of the cross. The cross was originally an object of hewn, non-living wood, which was used as an instrument of torture and death. And yet, in Orthodox Christian terms, the cross becomes not a symbol of death, but a symbol of the promise of resurrection and eternal life. St. Cyril begins the Slavic alphabet with the hope of this promise that Christianity offers to its believers, the hope of eternal life. Here we have before us the genius of St. Cyril, who chose this symbol, the cross, to be the first character of this new alphabet, for the only way in which it can be understood how the dead wood of the cross as an instrument of death can become the tree of life and a symbol of eternal life is to go from the aleph of mere understanding to an enlightened wisdom that teaches that the resurrection and eternal life are possible. It is to go from knowledge to that understanding which surpasses knowledge, in other words, to find wisdom, Sophia. We know from his life, of course, that St. Cyril was especially devoted to and dedicated to Sophia. It is only through Sophia that man is able to comprehend how after death there can be eternal life. Now consider the word naming this first letter. All the Slavic letters had words associated with them. When children first learn the English alphabet, they may learn it as A is for apple, B is for boy, C is for cat, and so on. But what if instead they learned the alphabet as apple, boy, cat, and so on? This is the way in which the Slavic alphabet was learned, with words representing each letter. Again, any word beginning with the letter A would have been sufficient for the purposes of the alphabet. But of all the words that he could have chosen, St. Cyril chose a rather simple word, az. That is the word in Old Church Slavonic that is the first person singular pronoun, I. Again, the genius of St. Cyril and his way of thinking is revealed in this choice. The choice of az to be the first word, the first letter of this new alphabet, perfectly embodies his hopes for the conversion of the Slavs. In Orthodoxy, each individual, the choices each makes and the life each one leads may lead to salvation or damnation. By emphasizing the individual in the context of the promise of eternal life, St. Cyril acted as a teacher and theologian. And once more, his belief in divine wisdom in Sophia is clearly underscored with this first letter, which is represented by the word for the first person singular. For of all living beings, only man is capable of achieving not only knowledge, but also wisdom. Thus, for the first letter, which is in the form of a cross, to be represented by the word for the first person singular pronoun is entirely logical and even theologically supported. It unites the individual with the hope of salvation. Over the course of centuries, different words have been supplied by various Slavs for the names of the letters of the alphabet. The inspired genius of St. Cyril is reflected in the words that he chose to represent the letters of the Glagolitic alphabet. For when a person said the names of those first three letters, he said, Az bukvy vyadam. I know letters, that is, I am literate. And with the next three letters, he said, Glagolati dobro jest. That is, it is good to communicate. Less than 1 century later, an unknown author, writing under the pseudonym of Chernorizets the bold monk, wrote Opismenech, a treatise on letters. In this treatise, Hraber described with great enthusiasm the superiority of the Slavic alphabet. Quote, therefore the Slavonic letters are more holy and more venerable because a holy man created them, whereas pagan Hellenes created the Greek. End quote. You can't argue with that. Thus, this moment in time is one of complete and successful assimilation of the Byzantine legacy by the Slavs. Through St. Cyril and with the assistance of his brother, St. Methodius, the Slavs were brought to Christianity through literacy. It was the single most successful conversion under the Byzantines. It was Han Boris, who was eventually baptized and canonized as Michael, the ruler of Bulgaria from 852 to 889, who chose to convert Bulgaria, adopting Christianity from Constantinople instead of from Rome. It was this decision, made at precisely this time, that made possible that the alphabet, Slavic writing, and native Slavic literacy were to flourish soon after the original mission of St. Cyril and Methodius to the West Slavs largely ended in failure. This happened soon after the death of St. Methodius in the year 885. Accepting Christianity, Bulgaria also accepted the Slavic alphabet and the first translations from Greek into Old Church Slavonic of those texts necessary for the Church. Soon, more translations and a few original works were created and disseminated throughout the Bulgarian Empire. The bold monk was writing in Bulgaria in the early 10th century, almost certainly during the so-called Golden Age of Tsar Simeon of Bulgaria. Simeon was the third son of Saint Boris Michael and ruled Bulgaria from 893 to 927. It is from works associated with Tsar Simeon of Bulgaria that it is possible for us to better understand the Slavs' attitude towards the Byzantine cultural legacy. We also know that Rus and Saint Vladimir received translations and a few original works in Slavic through the Bulgarians. This is the second moment in time that I will examine. Although some might consider it obvious or intuitive, I will state explicitly that the Slavs did not accept, but actually consciously rejected, a substantial portion of the Byzantine legacy. By this I refer to the pagan, non-Christian portion. This is particularly evident in the area of philosophy. The Belgian scholar Francis J. Thompson has over the past 50 years made an exhaustive study of medieval Russia, in which he considered all Slavic translations from Greek made from the time of the Kievan Rus era to that of Peter the Great. Dr. Thompson is a careful, thorough, especially meticulous scholar. His conclusions, therefore, tend to carry considerable weight. A 1999 edition with the title, The Reception of Byzantine Culture in Medieval Russia, contains 7 of his studies originally published in various journals between 1978 and 1995. In his 1978 article, which is first presented at the 8th International Congress of Slavists held in Zagreb, he concluded, quote, "It was not until the 18th century that the inheritance of impoverished, vulgarized Hellenism was overcome," end quote. In a later article, Thompson clarified, quote, "The conversion of Kievan Rus did not lead to the introduction of Byzantine Greek culture, but to the transfer en masse of the results of over a century of Bulgarian efforts to receive and adapt that culture to Bulgaria's own need," end quote. In yet another article, Thompson states that by the 14th century, quote, "Whereas many works of mystical theology had been translated, the great works of patristic dogmatic theology had not. The reason is not far to seek. Without some knowledge of classical philosophy, such works remain incomprehensible, and not a single philosophical work had been translated," end quote. Furthermore, he ultimately concludes, quote, "Byzantine culture died with Byzantium and was not continued in Muscovy," end quote. Simon Franklin, noted professor of Russian history at the University of Cambridge, like Francis Thompson, has considered the question of the reception of Byzantine culture by the Slavs. In a collection of 19 of his articles published between 1982 and 2000, with the title Byzantium, Rus, Russia, Studies in the Translation of Christian Culture, he comes to conclusions very similar to those of Francis Thompson. In his 1992 article, Philosophy and Philosophers in Rus, Simon Franklin writes, quote, "The textual history of philosophical passages tends to suggest that in Kievan Rus there was little or no active interest in philosophy as a theme, philosophy as a subject," end quote. And specifically in terms of historical works, in his article, Byzantine Empire and Kievan Russia, Franklin writes, quote, "If it has, as has been alleged, the Kievans read translated historiography primarily to gain knowledge of Byzantium, then they chose a strange way to go about it, for the choice of text for translation might almost have been specifically designed to exclude Byzantium, end quote. Later in that same article he writes, quote, Kievan culture was not in any remotely comparable way classically oriented, end quote. What could be the reasons for this seeming lack of interest and reception of this significant portion of the Byzantine legacy? In the past, certain authors had suggested that the Slavs did not have the necessary Slavic vocabulary or sufficient knowledge to understand and translate Greek secular and profane learning, including Greek philosophy. Francis Thompson has suggested that the Byzantine conquest of Bulgaria and literary stagnation during this early critical period, especially from the years 1018 to 1085, is largely to blame. In fact, the Slavs had the vocabulary and knowledge, but chose not to translate these types of works at this time. I will instead suggest that the reasons for rejecting or ignoring the classical Greek portion of the Byzantine legacy can be found in better understanding the history of the early translations and compilations undertaken in Bulgaria. In 2 volumes published in 2008, the well-known Dutch medieval Slavic scholar William R. Vader presented his reconstruction of the so-called Kняží Izbornik, or the Prince's Compilation for Education of the Heir. That such an Izbornik once existed is well argued, and he makes reference to 3 manuscripts that contain portions of this reconstructed text. The Minean Zbornik, specifically the text found in the Great Minea of St. Macari under February 29th, the Kняží Izbornik, found with that same title in 6 manuscripts, and the Izbornik of the Sinful Ioan, which is better known as the Izbornik of 1076. Vader should be credited with realizing that portions of these separate sets of text once constituted a whole, the purpose of which was to provide the future Christian ruler with a compilation of edificatory texts in order for him to be a good ruler. Scholars have largely come to agree with Vader's conclusions, in particular his statements that the Kняží Izbornik was originally written in Glagolitic and that it dates to the early 10th century, are generally accepted. According to Vader, the contents consist of 14 or 15 chapters, as follows and in this order: about merciful Suzomen, centuria attributed to Patriarch Gennadius, sentences attributed to St. Nilus of Sinai, St. Basil the Great's homily on how a man should lead an ascetic life, a selection from the Constitutions of the Holy Apostles, the wisdom of Jesus, the son of Sirach, teachings good for the soul by St. John Chrysostom, sentences of Ava Talasi, selections from the Church Fathers, a selection from the life of St. Xenophont, excerpt from the life of St. Theodora of Alexandria, questions and answers by St. Athanasius of Alexandria to Prince Antioch, and the Gnomai Monostichai of Menander. Finally, the exhortations of Deacon Agapetus, forgive my pronunciation, a work originally addressed to Emperor Justinian and intended to provide moral and religious guidance. I mention the contents of this type of Izbornik because, other than Menander, all the texts are by Christian authors. Even Menander's 185 one-line wisdom sayings were either sanitized or adapted to pass as Christian. I would also note that all the texts are pre-Justinian and originally date to the 5th or 6th century. 2 other manuscripts, the Izbornik of 1073 and the Izbornik of 1076, are also original compilations now known to be associated with Tsar Simeon of Bulgaria. We are indebted to the existence of the Kievan Rus copies of some 50 to 75 years after Simeon for preserving these compilations. We are also indebted to an increased research interest and scholarship of the past 25 years, as a result of which in-depth research and critical conclusions have added to our knowledge of the content and relationship of the 3 texts, the Kняží Izbornik and the Izborniks of 1073 and 1076. The Izbornik of 1073 has only 13 of its 266 leaves devoted to philosophical texts. These texts are by Saint Maxim the Confessor and Theodore of Reuthel. On the other hand, as shown in a 2005 article of William Vader, the dissertation of M.S. Mushinskaya, and in a recent article by the Bulgarian scholar Yavor Miltinov, in which he discusses the Zlatostrui of St. John Chrysostom, all three of these authors conclude that the Izbornik of 1076 shows direct parallels with the content of the Kняží Izbornik, including word-for-word identical texts. Scholarship has now confirmed and accepted the association and significance of Bulgarian Tsar Simeon and his literary circle in the first decades of the 10th century to all these compilations. Let me now return to the question of the Slavs, Rus, and what scholars of the past 50 to 70 years have referred to as the intellectual silence of medieval Rus, written about in a 1937 work of Father George Filovsky, entitled in English, Ways of Russian Theology, and again in a 1962 article entitled The Problem with Old Russian Literature. Tsar Simeon of Bulgaria was educated in Constantinople and knew Greek well enough that he was referred to as half Greek. In fact, he received a classical education in Constantinople. Therefore, the suggestion that the Slavs had neither the vocabulary nor adequate knowledge of the Greek language and Greek philosophy is immediately contradicted by Simeon. In addition, Simeon himself was not unique and led a circle of writers, translators, and copyists who also would have had a classical education and training. Given his background, given his wealth, given what is known to have been his intent to spread knowledge, we can only conclude that it was a conscious decision on the part of Tsar Simeon to exclude such references and content relating to Greek pagan philosophy and pagan culture in the 10th century writings and translations into Slavic for which he and his circle were responsible. In fact, this can be demonstrated when considering the Kняží Izbornik, which includes the in its fifth chapter, the brief work of St. Basil the Great entitled A Discourse on Ascetical Discipline. Had Simeon wished to give credence and legitimacy to the pagan portion of the Byzantine legacy, he could have included or also included another brief work by St. Basil the Great, the translated title of which is An Address to Young Men on the Correct Use of Greek Literature. Frederick Morgan Paddleford summarizes the introduction to this work by St. Basil as, quote, out of the abundance of his experience, the author will advise young men as to the pagan literature, showing them what to accept and what to reject, end quote. Even more revealing is the summation of St. Basil's first chapter of this work. Quote, to the Christian, the life eternal is the supreme goal, and the guide to this life is the Holy Scripture. But since young men cannot appreciate the deep thoughts contained therein, they are to study the profane writings in which truth appears as in a mirror, end quote. St. Basil goes on in the second chapter of this work to suggest, quote, profane learning should ornament the mind as foliage graces the fruit-bearing tree, end quote. And finally, in discussing the Christian ideal of virtue, a summation of the 10th chapter contains this thought of St. Basil, quote, while this ideal will be matured later by the study of the Scriptures, it is at present to be fostered by the study of the pagan writers. From them should be stored up knowledge for the future, end quote. Tsar Simeon would certainly have known of this work and the opinions of St. Basil, who was one of the greatest church fathers and authorities, one of the three holy hierarchs of the Christian church. Yet the young educated ruler chose not to impart this text as useful knowledge for a future ruler, or in a compendium of useful knowledge such as the Izbornik. Therefore, it would appear that Tsar Simeon, at this early, critical time in the transfer and absorption by the Slavs of the Byzantine legacy, consciously rejected pagan learning, choosing to ignore it completely. In other words, Tsar Simeon is the reason for the silence referred to by Father Florovsky in 1937 and again in 1962. Why would he make such a decision? Another Bulgarian historian, Angel Nikolov, published an article, the lengthy title of which translates as "The Idea of Piety and Wisdom of a Ruler in the Political Ideology and Public Propaganda of Bulgarian Sovereigns in the First Century after the Introduction of Christianity to Bulgaria, 866-971. Takes up half a page. In this article, Nikolov analyzes Saint Boris Michael, Tsar Simeon, and Simeon's successor, Tsar Petar, or Peter I. He summarizes the remarkable life of Simeon as follows. As the third son of Prince Boris Michael, Simeon entered a monastery and eventually took monastic vows. His father, Saint Boris Michael, abdicated to a monastery in 889, leaving his eldest son, Vladimir, to rule Bulgaria. Vladimir turned out to be an apostate who decided to return Bulgaria to paganism, going so far as to destroy churches and harm clergy. As a result, Saint Boris Michael left the monastery and helped overthrow his firstborn son in 893, eventually deciding to have Vladimir blinded. Saint Boris Michael even returned to rule for a short time in 893 before arranging for his third son, Simeon, to take the throne. I never did find out what happened to the second son. I'm sorry. Thus, after years of monastic life and actually being tonsured as a monk, Simeon was found forced by circumstances to renounce his vows and rule Bulgaria. At this critical time for Bulgaria, he also successfully battled Byzantium, and by the end of his rule in 927, he was acknowledged as a czar, and the Bulgarian church became autocephalous, becoming, I believe, only the sixth such patriarchate and the first to be acknowledged as such after the original five: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. Nikolov suggests that Simeon regretted leaving monasticism and his vows, and therefore chose, even as a ruler, to live as much of an ascetic life as was possible. He cites the conclusion of the Russian scholar Dmitry Bulanin that the, quote, conscious choice of the cultural paradigm made in Bulgaria at the end of the 9th century had consequences for all Slavic Orthodox peoples, and that because of this choice, succeeding generations of Slavic bookmen avoided Hellenic wisdom until in the 17th century became Hellenic delight, end of quote. However, Nikolov believes that St. Boris Michael, not Simeon, determined that course. And I would disagree. Simeon was better educated, he ruled for a greater length of time, over a much wider territory, and was wealthier. Furthermore, such a choice is more in keeping with his ascetic inclinations. Finally, Simeon would have had the example of his older brother, Vladimir, to serve as proof of the lasting ability of paganism to lure, seduce, and cloud the mind, particularly in these first decades after the conversion to Christianity. Nikolov also agrees that Simeon was responsible for the formation and content of the Izbornik of 1076, and undoubtedly responsible for the translation and inclusion of Deacon Agapet's exhortations to Justinian, which, according to William Vader, is the last work of the Knazi Izbornik. Thus, this second moment of time, roots of which began less than 50 years after the conversion of the Slavs, reflects the deliberate choice of the Bulgarians, as it turns out, on behalf of all the Orthodox Slavs, to reject the pagan portion of the Byzantine legacy. While they did so for their own reasons, that choice had the effect of making the same determination for the other Orthodox Slavs. Although Rus in the 9th and 10th centuries had contacts and even confrontations with Byzantium and Constantinople, it was not until the conversion in 988 that Rus became a part of what some call the Byzantine Commonwealth. Rus also became, in the term popularized by Riccardo Picchio, an integral part of Slavic Orthodoxy. Father Meyendorff, in his introduction to Byzantium and the Rise of Russia, a study of Byzantino-Russian relations in the 14th century, wrote, quote, "Compared to the other Orthodox Slavs, the Russians were more loyal to Byzantium," end quote. And in From Byzantium to Russia, Religious and Cultural Legacy, he again wrote, quote, "For almost 500 years, loyalty to the biggest Byzantine legacy was the underlying fact of Russian culture, with tensions and hostile incidents being the exception rather than the rule," end quote. Obviously, in large part, distance makes a difference. Constantinople is 160 nautical miles from Preslav, Simeon's 10th century capital of Bulgaria, and about 324 nautical miles from Skopje, the Serbian medieval capital of Stefan Dusan. It is 570 nautical miles from Kiev, 948 from Moscow, and 1,054 from Novgorod. Possibly this distance also explains why the Russian Church, for that same almost 500 years, was largely satisfied with their subordinate status as a metropolitanate of the Patriarch of Constantinople and having their metropolitans chosen or approved by Constantinople. The satisfaction of the Russian Church with its status is also cited by Father Meyendorff in that same article. Quote, "This explains the fact that the Byzantine ecclesiastical administration was accepted for so long in the lands of Rus," end quote. This situation was to last until the third moment of time upon which I will focus, the Council of Florence in 438-439, and more importantly, the aftermath of this council. In 1998, a scholar, V.M. Klos, published his major study on the various versions of the life of Saint Sergius of Radonezh. And according to Klos, the third redaction of the life of Saint Sergius was compiled in the 1450s or 1460s by Pachomius Logothet, the Serb, while a monk at the Holy Trinity Monastery of Saint Sergius. Klos had found only 4 copies of this particular redaction. I'm sorry. This redaction is distinctive because of the presence of a posthumous miracle of Saint Sergius of Radonezh that is found in these 4 manuscripts, with the title, Miracle in the Latin Lands. To the best of my knowledge, this miracle is no longer found in editions of the life of Saint Sergius. Hilandar's Slavic manuscript 485, which is dated to the 1540s, also includes this miracle. However, in the Hilandar manuscript, the title given is far more explicit regarding the significance of the intercession of Saint Sergius on behalf of Rus. In the original Slavonic, that title is «Сие чудо в латинских странах сотворив со святым Сергием по прославлению его, о Сидоре митрополите Московском, ежехотяще с Папой Римским, 8 собор Вселенский составите и Рус смесите с латиною, и обличен будет и не стерпя обличение со срамом извежен из епископия». In translation, the title is, "This miracle, which occurred in the Latin lands, was performed by Saint Sergius after his repose, about Isidore, the Metropolitan of Moscow, who wanted to create with the Roman Pope Eugenius an 8th ecumenical council and to co-mingle Rus with the Latins, and he was denounced, and not enduring the denunciation, with shame he fled, expelled from the episcopal see." Now that's a title. Just 14 years later, in 1453, Constantinople, the second Rome, fell to the Ottoman Turks. Its fall was seen as a prefigurement of the end of the world, expected by the Orthodox in the year 7000 after creation, or 1492 of the Christian era. Russia, of all the former Orthodox empires and countries, remained free and unconquered. But the aftershock of Byzantium's catastrophe shaped the Russian self-conception from that time forward. In their cultural worldview, the fall of Constantinople did not occur because of a political and military defeat, but instead it was a specific result of God's will as punishment for their sins, expressed as a denial of grace and the withdrawal of divine intercession and protection. The inevitable conclusion for the Russians, as expressed by the Russian, Yevgeny Golubinsky, in his History of the Russian Church, was the idea that there was something wrong with the purity of the faith of the Greeks, and by implication the South Slavs. Conversely, because the Muscovite state was at this time rising in strength and wealth, the Russians could only conclude that there was something right or correct about Russian Orthodoxy in Russia. In the Orthodox worldview, the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople and Byzantium was only comprehensible as punishment due to sins. And specific sins were easy to identify, chief among them the capitulation of Byzantium to the Latins at the Council of Florence. Again, to quote Golubinsky, quote, "The Council of Florence had the undesired, unexpected, and unwarranted effect of shaking the faith of the Russians in the faith of the Greeks," end quote. When God had acted as ultimate arbiter, they could draw no other conclusion. To sum up the situation from the Russian perspective, the traditional cultural system was disrupted, even compromised. The faith of the Greeks and South Slavs was found wanting, and the end of the world was to occur in less than 40 years. But the world did not end in the year 7000. As a consequence, the Russians, so to speak, found themselves living on borrowed time. Now that Russia alone survived to preserve and protect Orthodoxy, it was even more critical that Russia remain in God's grace. And not understanding exactly how to continue to receive God's grace and avoid God's wrath, it seems that they looked within themselves for the answers. They began to scrutinize, revise, and even reject parts of their Byzantine inheritance, coming to believe that their own particular rites and practices were purer. As a result, it might be suggested that at this time for the Russian Church, orthopraxis became as important as orthodoxos. Russian Orthodoxy, as a preserver and protector of Orthodoxy, now had another obligation, that is, to prevent its people from falling into sin, because the consequences could be most dire. One of the results of this conviction was that the orthodoxy of the Russians became more Russocentric and at the same time, I would say, more conservative. Concern was so great that it led to the creation of a secular typikon of sorts to assure proper conduct within the family, the domostroi, which is unique to Russian culture. In like manner, scholars have determined the penitential rules of the 16th century and later were much more detailed, probing, and elaborate than previous rules. The penances also became markedly steeper, and the consequences harsher. Just as Russian Orthodoxy had to protect its people from falling into sin, Muscovite Russia had the obligation to ensure that Russia itself remained a free and powerful state in order for it to be able to protect and promote Russian Orthodoxy and Orthodoxy. The fall of Kazan in 1552 to Tsar Ivan Grozny served as proof of the righteousness of Russia, its Tsar, and its people. It was the first victory of the Orthodox against the Muslims. It's a Muslim city. Astrakhan in 1556 was soon to follow. The frequent Russian church councils of the 16th century, especially those associated with St. Makarios, the councils of 1547, 1549, and 1551, reflect the growing concern for the purity of texts and rituals. The well-known Stoglav Council of 1551, to again quote Golubinsky, was called, quote, "to purify the Russian Church of all existing deficiencies," end quote. Saint Makary, Metropolitan of all Russia, with the support of Tsar Ivan Grozny, wished to standardize the Russian Church, and had the Stoglav Council actually succeeded in its goals, uniformity in the Russian Church would have been achieved much earlier. From heresy to music, to architecture and bell towers, to icons, to the numbers of saints, to how a Christian should behave and look, and so forth, the Russian church councils of those times wished to establish rules and order, to define what was good and pure and correct, or eliminate anything that could contaminate or taint Russian Orthodoxy. I would also note that the beginning of book printing in Russia dates from the same time, as a strong concern for the purity of texts and rituals. And St. Macarius, too, is associated with book printing. Printing, in fact, offered numerous advantages over the tradition of handwritten manuscripts, including the possibility for textual standardization and uniformity in form and function. It became possible to distribute hundreds of copies to many different places, thus ensuring uniformity and eliminating human error that might, in the extreme, even lead to sin or heresy. For these reasons also, the Russian Church had to maintain control and censorship over printing in Muscovite Russia, while at the same time the Church and state, in order to avoid potential contamination, actually greatly limited or even prevented the import of books from the Polish-Lithuanian state in the West, especially shortly after the time of troubles in the early 17th century. The printing of Muscovite editions had two other significant impacts beyond Muscovite Russia. The first is that the same uniformity of language in Russia that was now possible due to printing extended well beyond Muscovite Russia and impacted the South Slavs and others. With the arrival of the Russian printed text, we begin to see the development of a new pan-Orthodox Slavic literary norm, Church Slavonic, that is Russian Church Slavonic. In essence, this is the language of Russian 16th century printed books. It was this literary language and orthography, based on Muscovite printed texts, that became the dominant literary language and orthography among the Orthodox Slavs. This literary, largely artificial, largely unchanging language that is so closely identified with the Russian Orthodox Church continued to be used for hundreds of years. It was embedded in all the books needed by the Orthodox for the rites, services, and devotions. It is a language still sung when choirs sing in Church Slavonic. Muscovite printed books were only one manifestation of the impact of the Russian Church in Russia on the Orthodox Slavs and even the Greeks. Monetary support, seminary and lay education, military intervention, and even the significantly higher, almost overwhelming numbers of Russian monks. In 1912, there were 10,000 Russian monks on Mount Athos. There was 1,000 others, as an example. So these are some of the significant areas that dramatically affected the other Orthodox churches. In conclusion, the evidence is overwhelming that after the fall of Constantinople, it was the Russian Orthodox Church that was to lead, shape, reshape, and represent Orthodoxy. This held true for centuries, until the Bolshevik revolutions in the Soviet Union interrupted this process for almost exactly 75 years. However, since 1992, the Russian Orthodox Church has once again, I would say, regained its position of strength and authority as the largest, wealthiest Orthodox Church, one with a centuries-old legacy of thinking of themselves as the Church of the chosen people. The Russian Orthodox Church will undoubtedly continue to significantly impact Orthodoxy and the Byzantine legacy for many years to come. Thank you.
I'm sure that we have a multitude of questions that have come from this very fine and outstanding presentation. The way this is going to work, because we have people listening on Ancient Faith Radio, is I'm going to actually turn this mic when I'm finished. So if you have a question, if you would queue up now in this space here, that will move things along fast. Remember to keep your question concise. We don't need another lecture tonight, but I'm happy to entertain your questions. We may limit them to 3. So John, I knew you'd be the first one there. So line up behind John, and we'll be able to take at least 3 questions.
And I hope to be able to answer them.
All right, Professor Matejic, thank you very much. I was most curious about your second point, that Tsar Simeon setting the tone, as it were, for all of the Slav lands subsequently. What makes me curious about that is it seems clear to me that the Russians were quite selective, even in terms of adapting from the Bulgarian legacy. Just a few things that come to mind is that already in the hagiography of St. Vladimir, we can see he's usurping the roles of St. Cyril and Methodius. He finds the ancient manuscript with the Rus letters, for example, his associations with Kherson. Also, the lack of Bulgarian saints, oftentimes the Manea, St. Methodius himself disappears, on and on and on. So I'm curious, given this, obviously, on the one hand, selective appropriation of the Bulgarian legacy by the Russians, and on the other hand, the fact that they seem perfectly able to creatively appropriate from other peoples. Already in the hagiography of St. Sporus and Gleb, they're incorporating elements from the West Slavic tradition, St. Wenceslas. What makes it so certain that Tsar Simeon was the one to set the tone, as it were, considering they were creatively appropriating? Why stick on to that Byzantine ignoring or anti-Byzantine element, which is, continues on into the future?
In part, it's because that was the best time to have included or incorporated that. The other is that because of Bulgaria's problems with Byzantium and conflicts, the explanation of why certain texts were chosen, why certain histories and not others, why there was a worst explanation of Byzantium, of all the things that they specifically mentioned 3 chronicles, and I can't remember them right now, but it's Zenoras, it's Galitis, and it's one more. In other words, the chronicles that have the least amount of information about Byzantium. That this was the implication is a conscious decision to not give too much good information about Byzantium. So there's a certain amount of logic to it. And yes, of course, the Rus could have selected and whatever, but you first have to have a place from which to take that. And the best time to have produced this, the translations of that nature, would have been by the group of people who had been educated in a classical manner and already had the vocabulary knowledge to do that. I mean, there's a certain logical sense to it. I can't prove it, but it just seems to make sense that at the best time to have accomplished these translations and conveyed that knowledge, that it was not done. And I, to a certain extent, blame the experience of Tsar Simeon with his elder brother. But it's not one of those things that can be proven. At least it's an answer. I mean, no one else has actually. All the other answers I've heard about the silence of Rus have been to either denigrate the knowledge or denigrate the whatever, and that is just simply unacceptable. And to me, as I say, I can't prove it, but this really does make the most sense. That there was a time when it could have happened, it didn't happen at that time, and because of that, and then other things that happened, it didn't really. Strangely enough, it was Peter the Great who, in a way, united the legacy, because both of his impact on the church and the fact that he turned to the West. And so in a way, Peter the Great is the person who, once again, sort of unites the Byzantine legacy in Russia.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Paul Meyendorff, I teach liturgical theology here at the seminary. I have a question that's along liturgical lines, because in the 14th and early 15th centuries, we know that the Russian Church adopted lock, stock, and barrel the Neo-Sabbite synthesis brought by Metropolitan Cyprian of Kiev into Russia, and it penetrated and replaced both the cathedral and the Studite rites that had pre-existed in Russia, and it was very much adoption of contemporary Greek practice. Yes. Whereas obviously a century later, with the Niconian reform, there was a blanket rejection, at least by the old believers,
Yes.
of Greek practice. But in fact, the Niconian reform in the 17th century was also an adoption of contemporary Greek practice at that time. So I'm just wondering if that doesn't speak against kind of your broad, your broad scheme that you present as the thesis for your lecture.
Ricardo Picchio, in his lectures, and probably somewhere in his writings, I'm not sure exactly where, talked about the Great Hesychus Conspiracy. And what is the Great Hesychus Conspiracy? In 1375, you have a Bulgarian, Ephrem, who's appointed to be the Patriarch of Serbia. And in Bulgaria, you have the Hesychist, Saint Euthemius, 1375, same year. And in 1379, you have Cyprian, possibly another Bulgarian, possibly related to Saint Euthemius, who was appointed. It appears almost as though the Hesychists were attempting to do what the princes were not doing, that is, trying to unite all of Orthodoxy. What I'm getting at is that there was a great deal of literary, philosophical, everything. It was an incredible active time of intellectual activity. And because those who conveyed this, and also united with Byzantium, you have the introduction of the Jerusalem Typicon, which brings about the possibility for new kinds of literary works. This is where you have your petitioner canons. Malevin canon dates from that time. This is when the Crystal Theotokarion, the Stavro Theotokarion is introduced with that. So there are all these changes that require a lot of literary activity, a lot of copying of manuscripts and distribution of manuscripts. And at this time, when he left the Balkans, he took with him 8 manuscripts. 2 of them were produced in Hilandar, and they're still in Russia now. So that's how this got to them. I don't see it as really a contradiction to the general scheme of things, because at this time they're still part and parcel of part of this Byzantine Commonwealth, if you wish. I don't know how to explain it better. To me, it's almost as though Rus was Australia. Okay, it's kind of out there. And it's important, but it doesn't really factor in the middle of things. But after the fall, and because of all the changes, and because now it has to take on a completely different role. And in this role, all the things they talk about, Moscow III, Rome, and the imperialism and all that, it's really, I think, everything is justified not in those terms, but in terms of their desire to protect orthodoxy. And in order to protect orthodoxy, they have to have a strong state. So I'm not sure I answered your question very well, but I don't quite see the country. For me, it's not a contradiction. One of the things that I thought about, and I don't have the energy to try and investigate it, is why Hesychism does not seem to make more of an impact in Rus. In fact, there are so many that deny or say that really didn't. And one of the things I've been thinking about is that if the Hesychists are all in charge and all those countries fall, was Hesychism viewed for a time as being not really in the most favorable light? Because I can't quite understand why there wasn't more of a more visible impact in the Rus. It's there, and I would debate anyone who says it's not there, but it's not as obvious a thing. Now, to me, the Plotinia Sloves is pure Hesychism. The Hesychists wished to capture the essence of what they were describing with the word they were using. And so if you can't capture it with one word, you use a bunch of synonyms, and in that way you will capture the essence. I was fortunate enough to discover an unknown hymnographer of the 14th century. And his Hesychism, yeah, he's unique, by the way, in hymnography, in Orthodox hymnography. He wrote verses, Pievayami vnegda choshtashi, to be sung whenever you like. That is, he wrote verses for individual use, not as part of, and that is why there is only one copy of his works, and it's in Hilandar Monastery, because his works had no place in Orthodox services. What I'm saying is that there are things that were happening. We don't really have a complete picture of things. If we did, I think we would understand in particular how things that happened in one part of the, I once called it, there's a system of checks and balances in Orthodoxy, because you have this community, and that's why extremes were very rare in Orthodoxy, because reactions, if there was a reaction of one group to, I've got a problem with this group of people, they don't want to have children, and the Byzantines will say, well, leave them alone for 40 years, they won't be around, don't worry about it, you don't have to persecute them, after a while they won't. Well, when you no longer have someone giving you this benefit, and you've got to make all these decisions on your own, and you're worried about not falling into sin and error, everything takes on a slightly different urgency, I would say. And I think this is what was happening. And I think this had an impact that actually lasted for a long time in Russia. Now, why does it change? It changes because, well, the world does not end, except for with the old believers or old ritualists. For them, the world could end at any moment, and still might. But look who you have now running the country. Look at Catherine and Peter. You have Catherine, who names her son Constantine because she hopes he's going to rule in Greece. So, in other words, you can't blame the Greeks. You can't continue to blame them for everything. At some point, you have to say, okay, we've gotten over this bad period, and so now we're going to look at things differently, which is why they're able to contemplate adapting, being more in line with. And I'm sorry, you didn't want another lecture, but it's hard to answer these questions. It really is. So I hope that in some way helps.
Again, Dr. Predrag would like to express our thanks. Before we go downstairs, where there's a reception on the floor just below this one, not the bottom floor that many of you are used to, the one just below this one, there's actually overflow outside, and I believe it's nice and cool outside this evening. You're all invited to that reception. But before we do, we have one more presentation to make this evening. I was thinking, as our two metropolitans were speaking tonight, of something that I witnessed, and many of you witnessed, at the All-American Council in Toronto. And that was the moment when Bishop Basil came to us, not in person but on screen, making mention of the bilateral commission between the Orthodox Church in America and the Antiochian Archdiocese. Spontaneously, everybody in that hall got to their feet and were applauding. I would say that tonight, in a way that only St. Vladimir's can, we breathe new life into that bilateral commission, and the relations between the Orthodox Church in America and the Antiochian Orthodox Christian Archdiocese have been sealed in a way that is unique and energizing, and we look forward to what the Lord will bring through the guidance of the Holy Spirit in your years of leadership and primacy in this country. So as a small memento to mark the occasion, we have two photographs, one for Sayedna Joseph of the entire Antiochian community here at St. Vladimir Seminary, and one for your beatitude of the entire OCA community here. John will present the OCA one, I'll present the Antiochian one. For all of your lands.
Perhaps I should have his and he should have mine.
While we're still standing, we'll be able to intone It Is Truly Meet.
St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary seeks to serve the Orthodox Church through theological education and scholarship. It educates future priests and contributes directly to Orthodox theology through the scholarly activities of its faculty. Voices from St. Vladimir's Seminary is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.